And so we're going to continue with our second panel, Languages and Nightingales, the Politics and Poetics of Armenian Linguistics and Literary Cultures. And for this, we're inviting back Michael Pifer and Murat Cankara, and Karla Mallette is our commentator. And I'll pass it over to Karla right away to introduce our speakers.
Good morning. I'm Karla Mallette. I wanted to begin just briefly by thanking the Armenian community for welcoming me. I'm thanking especially the two directors who have overlapped with my time at Michigan, and that is Catherine and Girard, for really welcoming me. I am kind of I think the only, maybe not the only, but one of the few wannabe Armenians in the room. And I've really felt welcomed by the community, and have learned so much as part of the community and on the fringes of this community. And really, what I've learned has enriched my own work, particularly interested in all of these intersections of languages and cultures. That is so much at the heart of what the Armenian Studies program does, and the fascinating programming that the Armenian Studies program has supported since I've been here at Michigan. The two speakers that we have on this panel are part of kind of products of this community, part of this rich intellectual life. We'll first hear from Murat Cankara, who was a postdoc here in 2012, 2013. I remember his talk while he was here. I'm absolutely shocked that it was so long ago, because the memory of it is very fresh in my mind. Really dynamic, really rich and interesting work. I think we're about to hear about some expansions of the work that you were doing while you were here, Murat. Today he is at the Social Sciences University of Ankara, and his talk is on late Ottoman press and the Armenian appropriation of the Turkish language. Then next we'll hear from Michael Pifer, who got his PhD from Michigan in 2014. Kevork chaired his committee. Catherine Babian and I were both on the committee. Again, I have vivid memories of the work, which has kind of remained part of our intellectual ambit, because we had a manuscript workshop with Michael. The manuscript is now in press at Yale University Press. I really look forward to that book coming out. Michael had, after he got his PhD in 2014, he had a postdoc here in Armenian Studies, and since then has been teaching in the Armenian program. And we're very happy and lucky to have him still as part of the community. His talk is called Seeking Doctrine in the Ambiguous Poetry of Medieval Anatolia. They'll have 20 to 25 minutes each to speak, and I will then make a very brief comment in order to turn the floor over to your questions. So let's welcome first Murat Cankara.
Thank you for the opportunity, the invitation, the support, the organization. I cannot really tell what it means to me at the moment, believe me. This is not a paper per se. I would like to share with you a trajectory from the academic year 2012-2013, when I was a visiting fellow here in Ann Arbor with Ohannes and Hakem, to this day, when I'm a floating fellow in Ankara, if not a drowning one yet. Basically, I'll try to show why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I came to this subject or whatever. In the wonderful year I spent here in Ann Arbor as a Manoogian fellow, I had a great opportunity to revise my dissertation, which was basically on the early Armeno-Turkish nouns, as some of you might already know. Moreover, I was surrounded by people and texts that I had not even dreamed of while working for my degree. One scholarly outcome of this good year in my life was an article titled Rethinking Ottoman Cross-Cultural Encounters, Turks and the Armenian Alphabet, in which I presented examples of Turkish statesmen, authors, and journalists who were either aware of or could read Armeno-Turkish, and tried to demonstrate how Armeno-Turkish might have served as a kind of lingua franca among the members of different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups in the empire. I went back to Istanbul in June 2013, the middle of the Gezi protests, and moved to Ankara in the summer of 2014 with the hope and promise of an Armenian studies program in a newly established liberal state university. Please forgive the oxymoron. Anyways, things fell apart in the blink of an eye, and no more words on this. Meanwhile, I published 2 Armeno-Turkish texts. The first one, Boşboğaz Bir Adem, was printed in 1852 by Josep Vartanyan. I would like to thank Kevork Bardakçıyan for his support, help, and for his giving me the text. And we would talk on the text together with him in his office for long hours. Boşboğaz Bir Adem, Şada Hosmart mı? I think Vartanyan would say it that way in an article. Anyways, this is a short piece of satire in which the author blended the comic and the dramatic, which he could probably have done only in Armeno-Turkish at the time. While editing this book, I was not only transliterating it, but also modernizing the language for readers, for contemporary readers. I had trouble in detecting when comic effect was intended through the use of language, like pronunciation, word choice, etc., because one could not talk about a deviation where one does not know what the standard is or was. Then came the other book. Ankara Vukuatı, Menfilik Hatıralarım by Simone Arakelyan, published in 1921, The Ankara Incident and My Memoirs of Exile. This is a quite early testimony written in Armeno-Turkish by a Catholic Armenian from Ankara. This was quite an experience for me, not only because I was working on the text exactly a century later in 2015, exactly in the same place, Ulus, the old center of Ankara, and bombs were literally exploding around. But what was really harder for me was to translate a testimony from Turkish into Turkish. Why had Arakelyan written in Turkish, and especially in high register of Turkish, which we could call Ottoman Turkish, the language of the archive, so to speak? I will not go into the details of this here, but this made me realize how testimonies almost exclusively reached us through translations of sorts, and language played an extremely important role in mass violences. This eventually led me to the infamous Watts incident for me. I wrote a paper asking the differences, if there are any, between genocides in monolingual and multilingual spaces, based on testimonies on Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, never presented, never submitted, waiting to be developed. I could have presented it here as well, but I have to be careful with what I'm doing. So before I came here, I had to give an abstract of my presentation here so that I could be given permission. Or more precisely, I have to be able to see when I have to be careful, to decide when I have to be careful. A lesson drawn from testimonies. In short, if I were to define my research as a post-Manoogian fellow, I would say that I have shifted my attention from script to language. In other words, the title Armenians and the Turkish language, rather than Turks and the Armenian alphabet, has been appealing to me recently. So far, there have been 3 components that fall under this category in my research. The first one, I developed a database project on Armenian linguists, lexicographers, etc., who worked on the Turkish language. The proposal was rejected by my university once, but I will keep working on it. Second, the theme language and violence. Apart from Arakelyan's testimony that I have mentioned shortly before, this has been an intriguing issue for me since the late stages of my PhD. It consists of a critique of historiography and performance analysis. This is both about Armenian actors and actresses' pronunciations and accents in Ottoman theater, and about how the Armenian stereotype in Ottoman popular performances transformed into a figure characterized by his poor Turkish and very bad pronunciation by late 19th and early 20th century. Very interesting story. This resulted in an article titled "May a Wasp Sting Your Tongue: The Armenian Stereotype in Ottoman Popular Performances from the Empire to the Nation States." Armenians, who made a major contribution to the standardization of Turkish language, were now being mocked on stage for deviating from that standard. Yet, as time passed, I realized that it was not easy to perceive the relation between language and violence unilaterally. The early plays written and staged in Saint Lazare around late 18th and early 19th centuries by Mikitarists were quite interesting in this sense. For example, the Armenian authors, directors of these plays, would at times express their true feelings and maybe even insult the Turkish character through the Jewish stereotype, who himself would hide behind the excuse of his poor Turkish. I don't know Turkish that well, so I'm not insulting you. I have not been able to finalize this draft essay yet. Third, the third component, which finally brings us to the title of this presentation, the subject of this presentation. As of June 2018, I began to edit a section in the monthly periodical Toplumsal Tarih, Social History. Its title is Osmanlı'da Gayrimüslim Basından, From the Non-Muslim Press in the Ottoman Empire. The idea behind this was, A, to question historiography of press in the Ottoman Empire. This is our classical story. You know, Ottoman press is not Muslim Turkish press, only there were Armenian press. That's simple. B, to give voice to those publications and people which have hitherto been overlooked or mentioned only in footnotes. You know, in the literature, we hear about lots of Armenian periodicals, newspapers, who, provoked people, did this, did that, but not even a single article is around. C, to promote a conceptual and relational perspective on the Ottoman press. D, and of course, to provoke some thought, if not to cause a stir. So far, I have published 13 texts in periodicals between 1852 and 1915. One Hebrew, one Arabic. These are done by my friend Selim Tezcan, by my colleague in the history department. 3 Greco-Turkish, 1 Armenian, 7 Armeno-Turkish texts. Okay, so it looks something like this in each issue, 5 or 6 pages, like one from Mecmua-i Havadis. I try to give the impression that I'm not doing it only for my personal interest, so the subjects vary, but every now and then I try to bring it back to the language issue without people noticing it, hopefully. This is from Zohal, 1850s again, 1915, on Zabel Yeseyan, and the Turkish she uses in her novels, a literary review in a Protestant publication. Kirkor Zohrab on literature and French influence and realism at the time. This was interesting, the last one. Kendini Müslüman hocaya okutan papaz. Apparently a priest fell sick, so he went to a hoca for remedy, and then this caused a huge issue. Really interesting stuff. Anyways, one of my concerns about the Armeno-Turkish publications has been to understand how authors justify writing in Turkish, so I'm trying to dig out details. Here are some of the reasons they provide for preferring Turkish language over Armenian. 1. Turkish is the primary language of the majority of the Armenian population living in the Ottoman Empire. The other, reading Armenian necessitates training either in classical Armenian and French or in modern Armenian, which has not fully developed yet and therefore needs to borrow words from other languages. So writing in Armenian would deprive thousands of people of a basic right. One other, majority of Turcophone Armenians have not received proper education, so we have to find a way of reaching them. One other, as time passes, those who read Armeno-Turkish will become passionate about and interested in Armenian publications. This, by the way, Armeno-Turkish as a step towards Armenian itself reminds me of Sebuh Aslanzian's paper on Mihitar Sepastatsi's 1727 Armeno-Turkish, Armenian grammar in Armeno-Turkish. So it's very interesting in that sense. One other, depending on the religious order, since our connationals are more in relationship to their Turkish neighbors, they need support in political debates and should be able to show their nation's perspective to their neighbors. So if a debate is heated, we want our connationals to show them their newspapers. You say that, but see how our newspaper reads. Feelings of shame, belatedness, as well as apology for writing in Turkish are all over the place. Yet there is at least one author who strongly argues that the adoption of Turkish is the only way to survive for Armenians. Otherwise, another language, and I guess he's implying Russian here, will swallow up Armenian in this case. So, what are we to make of these? One, there are the following questions to begin with for me. What is an Armenian newspaper? A newspaper totally in Armenian language? One that is edited by an Armenian? Does one with Turkish pages count? What difference does it make if the Turkish pages are in Arabic or Armenian scripts? Normally, I wouldn't mind these questions because that a newspaper is Armenian or Turkish or whatever is but an outdated question for me. It belongs to another age. I'm not interested in that. However, I should note this. The way the existing literature defines, categorizes, and deals with the Armenian press in the Ottoman Empire makes it impossible to see the negotiations and tensions buried in the pages of these periodicals in terms of language and script. The balance between languages, the disturbance of this balance for some reason, the switch from Armeno-Turkish to Armenian after a certain year, or the increase in the number of pages in Turkish and the announcement of that, or vice versa. Therefore, I find it very important and rewarding to look at the Armenian press from this perspective and would encourage graduate students to do it, if I had any, of course. 2, the conceptual dimension. Exophony, that is stepping outside one's mother tongue to express oneself, and language choice are among the first to come to mind when faced with Armeno-Turkish writings of this sort. However, here I would like to bring up another couple of concepts, thanks to Karla Mallette, who had introduced the work of Sheldon Pollack, the acclaimed scholar of Sanskrit and comparative intellectual history, to me. The concepts in question are cosmopolitan and vernacular, where in his article he compares cosmopolitan and vernacular practices in cases of Western Europe and Southeastern Asia. It was inspiring. So what he means is this, I quote, cosmopolitan and vernacular can be taken as modes of literary and intellectual and political communication directed toward two different audiences, whom lay actors know full well to be different. The one is unbounded and potentially infinite in extension. The other is practically finite and bounded by other finite audiences, with whom, through the very dynamic of vernacularization, relations of ever-increasing incommunication come into being. We can think of this most readily as a distinction in communicative capacity and concerns between a language that travels far and one that travels little. End of quote. Within this framework, I would say that for the Armenian author, the whole thing appears to be a negotiation between the cosmopolis and the vernacular, like Handramancheli, Askain. Which one? To be accessible to all, or to be national? The irony here is that at times one must choose the vernacular to reach a cosmopolis. In other words, one must write not only in Turkish, but especially in simple, plain daily Turkish, Kaba Türkçe, as they would say, in order to reach a wider audience. This, on the other hand, could cut you off from another cosmopolis that included Armenians living in the Russian Empire, let's say, or even from Armenians living in city centers, learning Armenian in a more standardized way in schools and not knowing Turkish except basic daily usage, which is a problem. 3, and last, there is, of course, much more to be done. I have been trying to dig out samples from a limited corpus. These are sporadic examples, I know. A diachronic reading seems to be necessary to see if there is significant change in Ottoman Armenians' appropriation of the Turkish language through these years. For example, what happened when the Constitution of 1876 made it compulsory to know Turkish in order to serve as a state official? Birinci Meşrutiyet. Moreover, we need more evidence before we make sweeping generalizations on the relation between language and religious order, mezhep, like what was going on there. Indeed, not even mezhep. Once we look at how words such as mezheptaş, milletdaş, vatandaş, hemşehri, we see that the matter is even more complicated. Within circles of identities, in Vartanyan's case, for example, Ottoman, Armenian, Catholic, Lucitarian, like circle within a circle, language choice played a pivotal role for transgressing boundaries. This is all I have to say for now. If I have not already said too much, I have reserved the examples for, if we have time or for the discussion, but let me show. Okay, So I translated these for this presentation from Mecmuai Havadis, Zohal, İzmirli, Hüsnü Niyet, Rahnuma. I try to summarize them, but in the QA, we could just spend more time on that. Thank you so much for your patience.
Hello. I just want to also begin by extending my thanks to Melanie and to Naira and to Catherine and Jidar and Kevork and Ron for building this program and providing sort of the laboratory for so much of our thinking and our projects. The poem I'm going to talk about today, I first read in one of our Armenian studies classes taught by Kevork, and my thinking about it has developed in conversation with so many of you in this room. So I feel really grateful to continue that conversation today. Okay. Today I'm going to briefly discuss one of the most well-known and debated poems in medieval Armenian literature, Konstantin Yerzingatsi's Ode to the Rose and Nightingale, written sometime near the end of the 13th century in medieval Anatolia. The poem has attracted the attention of scholars for one reason in particular. Konstantin does not use the Armenian word for nightingale, sohag, but rather employs a Persian term, bulbul. As many scholars have observed, the poem shares several other affinities with Persian literature, such as the nightingale's intoxication by the sight and smell of the rose, a trope that appears in the poetry of Attar and Rumi as well, two Persian contemporaries, near contemporaries. Other scholars, such as V.S. Nersessian, have conversely argued for a more indigenous Armenian genesis for the poem, positing that similarities with Persian or Turkish literature are merely coincidental. In my short talk, I will attempt to sort of shift this debate, changing our focus from the problem of origins to a question of hermeneutics, which, as we shall see, the poem is intimately concerned with. In other words, as I shall argue, it isn't just that there are multiple ways to read this poem, but rather that the poem is, in some sense, about correctly reading and making sense of literary symbols, discourses, and tropes that were the domain of no single people, language, or religious culture in medieval Anatolia. So, let's dive in. Konstantin, we know, was educated at a monastery, and at least until the age of 15. He probably wrote his poetry either for his brothers in Christ or for an urban confraternity in Yerzinga, or Erzincan. In either case, a subtle didacticism runs through his verses, and this particular poem is no exception. His work bears a simple heading. This poem tells of Christ through the example of the rose, it says. Konstantin goes on to depict a fragrant garden, right on the verge of spring. Here, the birds burst into song, intoxicated by the ravishing aroma of a blossoming world. Yet all is not peaceful in the garden. One freshly budded flower, the jealous violet, hatches a plot with his comrades to kill the rose before it can bloom. Fortunately, their plan never comes to fruition. At the last minute, a warbling nightingale, the bulbul, bursts into the garden with good tidings. Quote, "The rose has awoken from his green tent," he proclaims, end quote. The wicked flowers disperse, put to shame. Meanwhile, the nightingale immediately swoops to the side of the rose, singing in drunken revelry. What is unusual, and I think highly revealing, is not necessarily that Persianate or Islamicate literary tropes also appear in Konstantin's poetry, but rather what he does and does not do with them. Gradually, as the poem continues, the nightingale fades from view. Then the bird disappears entirely. And here is where things start to get really interesting. In its stead, as the rose tells us, physicians enter the garden. wise men gather the rose, carry it off, and grind it into a variety of medicinal products. And I quote, "Those physicians, hakemen, gather me, bear me off, and mix me with sugar, and fashion a rose conserve, guba shakar. I become a remedy for the heart's pain. Then they bake me in fire and make a sherbet for the market. Some buy me and carry me off as a remedy for every affliction of the infirm. And they extract the water of my heart and fill me in glass bottles, shisha. They sell me as rose water, for I have the fragrance of immortality. For this reason, I freely bear the center of my heart, which is yellow. Whoever sees my heart exposed, let him come and hear my woes." In the place of the rose garden, we now encounter a world of shops and stalls, the jostling panoply of the Anatolian marketplace. In the place of the nightingale, we meet the hakim, or physician, the wise man who knows how to mix an enticing remedy, a palatable medicine, to cure the heart's pain. And in place of the rose, flourishing in its native garden, we find a conserve of roses, the flowery paste of rose petals and sugar that becomes a cure for every affliction of the infirm. Finally, the rose makes a striking command. Anyone who glimpses the rose's heart should listen to its tales of sorrow, the fundamental complaint, the gangad, of love and of lovers. So, what are we to make of these lines? Medieval audiences, it would seem, had difficulty interpreting the rose's speech. This is not altogether startling. After all, Constantine also composed less cryptic, amorous poetry on the rose and the nightingale. And so perhaps his audience had certain expectations for this theme here. But Constantine, quite clearly, did not wish only to compose worldly poetry, devoid of instruction, for his brothers. He therefore wrote a second poem that offers an explicit exegesis of the first. Constantine even complains in the heading of the second poem that listeners needed to attend to his words more carefully. Quote, "A concise exegesis on the rose," he writes. "I fashioned this for the ignorant, for they thought that the poem of this rose, or the words of this rose, was of the world, the marnavor, of the body. So for that reason, I wrote this," end quote. We are then treated to a remarkable metamorphosis in which Constantine leads us, almost line by line, through the original poem, carefully bringing its hidden meanings into the light of day. Quote, "Brother, give ear and take heed, that I may recite an explanation. Who is the crimson rose, or who are those flowers? Or who is the love of the rose, or who is the voice of the nightingale? Or who are those flowers that took flight from the rose? The flowers who assembled, those are the priests of the old law. And the inflamed crimson rose, this was Jesus, the only begotten of the Father. The violet that gathered all the flowers equally, this was the disciple Judas, who betrayed the celestial king unto death." And, quote, he quotes his own poetry line for line, "The nightingale suddenly arises and cries over the rose. This was the trumpet of the resurrection, which Gabriel made resound at dawn. The rose who rent his green cassock and donned crimson satin, that was Christ, who, by his blood, arose to heaven from the dead." As Constantine's explanation continues, the familiar tale of rose and nightingale is miraculously transmuted into the story of Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. Thus, as Constantine explains, the flowers who fled from the rose were actually, quote, "the soldiers who became like the dead from the fear of his voice," end quote. Other flowers were Jews who converted to Christianity, or the demons who trembled from fear at his resurrection. In other words, Constantine overlays the panorama of Christ's final days on earth upon a familiar poetic tableau. In this case, through the rose-nightingale trope, which previously was not part of the symbolic vocabulary of Armenian Christianity in Anatolia as far as we knew. It would seem then that Constantine wished to transmit a certain kind of knowledge about Christianity to his spiritual brothers. And yet we should also ask, if his aim was truly to transmit knowledge of Christianity in a simple manner, as a way of clarifying Scripture for the unlettered, why bother to crowd the scene with a hodgepodge of distracting metaphors? After all, as Constantine begrudgingly admitted, the presence of his rose and nightingale seems to have thrown the medieval audience through a loop, who interpreted these figures in accordance with the flesh, or the world, and not through the eyes of the soul. So, why write like this at all? To address these questions, it is instructive to look elsewhere in Anatolia, beyond the horizons of Armenian literary production. As I have suggested, Constantine's audience may have had difficulty reading the rose and nightingale in this different light. Their expectation for this trope, which was commonly used at this time in both Armenian and Islamic poetry, was perhaps too firmly established. Of course, while this is to some degree only speculation, Constantine was hardly the only poet to struggle with this problem. Not so far from Yersinga, in the city of Konya, Constantine's contemporary, the famous Persian poet Rumi, likewise taught his audience to read certain literary tales and tropes in new ways. And in fact, Rumi's son, Sultan Valad, also sent representatives to Yersinga slightly later in the century, spreading Rumi's teachings. For instance, Rumi often adapted the popular Arabic frame tales known as the Kalila wa Dimna to reveal higher or spiritual meanings, knowing full well that his adaptation would, quote, oppose the received way in which these fables are read, end quote, as Christine van Rumbeek has observed. In the most blatant example of this, Rumi acknowledges his audience's familiarity with one story from the Kalila wa Dimna, even while he unsettles our expectation about what that story means. Quote, you would have read this in the Kalila, he warns his listeners, but that is the tale's rind, while this is the marrow of its inner spirit. True to form, what follows is no longer a simple tale of three fishermen, which is the tale from the Kalila, but rather a complex meditation on ritual ablution. In essence, as Rumi tells us elsewhere, he did not merely seek to show audiences what popular stories really mean, but rather to free his audience from the craving, quote, the craving for mimicry, translated by Nicholson as the bondage of formalism. Those who cleave too tightly to outward form, to the most literal meaning of words and stories, might as well complain that the characters of Kalila and Dimna, who are both jackals, cannot actually speak in human language in the first place. To insist on a literal reading of their frankly impossible discourse would only be to double down on a paradox. It would be, as Rumi tells us, like a king who hears a fable about a miraculous tree and then wastes his precious resources to acquire its non-existent fruit. The tree, the outward form of our stories, is ultimately only another heuristic. Hence, Rumi disavows a slavish dependence on literalism and literary form. And this is from the Masnavi. O brother, a tale is like a measure, and within it, spiritual meaning is like a seed. A wise person shall acquire the seed of meaning. He shall not behold the measure, though it may be taken away. Give ear to what transpires between the nightingale and the rose. although no speech is evident in that place. Again, the point here is simple. Roses and nightingales do not converse in New Persian sentences, nor do they speak in Anatolian Turkish, nor in Middle Armenian, nor in any other language. Instead, the symbolic discourse of the rose and nightingale provides a vital clue that a different game is afoot, one that does not rely on a literal reading of form. The rose and nightingale are, in no uncertain terms, also heuristics. They signal to an audience to look beyond narrative and uncover another pattern, another mode of meaning-making that is lurking somewhere past the words themselves. Likewise, I think it is clear that Konstantin's adaptation of the rose and nightingale obviously does more than impart religious instruction in an entertaining manner. His poetry, like Rumi's, is revealing for what it doesn't do. Konstantin might have simply rewritten the original poem to make its Christian resonances more plain, but he eschews this option. The deficiency is not in his poem, he says, but rather in the way that his audience fixates on its outward form, its flesh or its body. They aren't reading it right. And so he leads his public on a journey back through the principal lines of this poem, culminating with a return to its strange ending. In a similar vein as Rumi, who rewrote a tale from the Kalila Udimna to comment on ritual ablution, Konstantin reimagines the Poetics of the Rose and Nightingale as a complex meditation on the divine sacraments, the only remedy for the sorrows of heartache. And I think especially here, this is where his poem pushes us to move beyond sort of just a mere shared tropology, where, bulbuls exist in Persian, they exist in Armenian. Great, there's correspondence. It does something else. As we recall, although wise men may have entered the garden and sold its roses in the marketplace, this labor is no less miraculous. Konstantin thus invites his audience to reread these verses through fresh eyes. Those physicians gather me, bear me off, and mix me with sugar, and fashion a rose conserve, the Persian term gulba shakar, and keep me as a remedy for the heart's pain. And then he explains, that was the body of Christ, the bread of life of the Holy Mass. And the physicians are the priests, the remedy and the doctor of the sinner. Then they bake me in fire and make a sherbet for the market. Some buy me and carry me off as a remedy for every affliction of the infirm. That was the blood of Jesus, the atoner of the transgressor's sins, which all of those sick in sin shall take and be made well. They extract the water of my heart and fill me in glass bottles. They sell me as rose water, for I have the fragrance of immortality. Those are the soldiers who pierced me. Streams of water and blood burst forth. That water was a sign of the baptismal font, our eternal salvation. Now here I think the simplicity of Konstantin's commentary belies the complexity of the instruction he seeks to bestow. The rose has long been a symbol of God in Persian poetry, playing on a visual pun between the word for rose, the gol, and the word for the divine, or the all, the kul. Konstantin extends this metaphor to its most logical Christian conclusion. If Jesus is the rose, then the sundry products distilled from the rose, conserves, sherbets, rose water, must therefore also be analogs for communion and baptism, those remedies for sin. The correspondence here is apt. Roses were one of the 4 Galenic cordial flowers, prized for their medicinal properties throughout the pre-modern Mediterranean world. It is, I think, extremely unlikely that Konstantin and his brothers did not also use these aromatic products in Yersinga. Muslims and Christians would have settled their stomachs with a little rose conserve after an unpleasant meal, just as they would have occasionally cleansed their homes with a sprinkling of rose water. On one level, then, Constantine's exegesis clearly serves as a commentary on the sacraments of the Armenian Church. We are to reflect on the holy body and blood of Christ as medicines akin to floral remedies that were already consumed by Muslims, Christians, and Jews in medieval Anatolia. Even more, Constantine translates the everyday wares of the bazaar, the economic heart of Yersinga, into a Christological framework. On another level, Constantine's poem also guides its audience to reflect on rose products in terms of Christ's body and blood. His is a project of correspondence construction, in other words, and this correspondence cuts both ways. What Constantine's poem teaches, then, is how to get at the marrow of the spirit of these things, including a shared poetic language in Anatolia, the rituals and sacraments of the Armenian Church, and the everyday aromatic wares of the bazaar. It is a hermeneutic that is expansive, springing from the hidden wellsprings of a text or a voice, resounding outwards into the social and spiritual world of medieval Anatolia. Arguably, then, in both the poetry of Christians and Muslims in this region, the stakes of this kind of writing and reading go far beyond transmitting orthodoxy via the entertaining channels of poetry. Rather, this kind of poetry helped audiences to navigate a world in which the salient reference points, the bazaar, common food products and medicine, gardens, popular literary tropes and stories, were not part of the domain of any single people. Put simply, such poetry helps one to make sense of a world that is awash with others and oversaturated with the meanings and interpretive frameworks of others. This literature therefore offers something like a poetics of encounter and a method for meaning making, which is to say the same thing. Thank you.
Okay, so Murat and Michael, I didn't get to use my 5 minutes left sign once. And Murat and Michael came in, both of them, on time, if not under time. So we have plenty of time to discuss, because this panel is supposed to end at 1, right? No. I mean at 12. Yeah, so we have plenty of time. Sorry. So as promised, I will make brief comments and kind of open up to questions about these two papers, which fit together really nicely, kind of grow together as a garden, if you will. I'm going to start with Murat's talk because it was first and because it was kind of chronologically subsequent, and because I think that it gives us a good place to kind of like begin thinking about, thinking against the ethno-sectarian and linguistic logic of the modern state, which is what both of these talks do. They encourage us to push back against kind of the ethno-sectarian logic of the modern state, but they also trouble the linguistic ideology of the modern state, that kind of complacent faith in monolingualism, right, in the national language which is meant to correspond ideologically with the mother tongue. It's the language that we're born speaking, that we hear in the womb, that we grow up speaking, and that we then learn to kind of commit to the paper. And that becomes the discourse, the linguistic currency of the literature, of the nation state, of public life in the nation state. This is a gorgeous idea. It certainly is the practice that most of us learned as students in school, those of us who are scholars of literary history, that we kind of grow up believing in and promoting in our own ways in our own departments in North American and European universities. It's a beautiful idea, but it's very simplistic. It doesn't really describe practice on the ground, as we're beginning to see, I feel, increasingly in the 21st century, and as pre-modern literary traditions show us very clearly. Pre-modern literary traditions kind of agitate that complacent relationship between state, territory, and language, right? The idea that that language saturates a place, and that's why it becomes the cultural currency of the nation. So I think that the negotiations that we saw in Murat's talk, which are represented in print, in other words, in the format, the familiar form of modern and contemporary cultural practice and literature represented in print. Those negotiations are a component of pre-modern linguistic and literary practice, and we saw them, of course, also in full bloom in Michael's talk. Murat said, I wrote down a line from his talk, language choice played an important role in transgressing boundaries. I think language choice played an important role, period. In literary traditions, in pre-modern literary traditions, in Ottoman literary traditions, which is what we're mainly hearing about in Murat's talk, language choice is the fundamental ethical choice made by the author. Language choice becomes kind of the ethical foundation of the literary text. We don't reflect all that much on language choice and the choices that writers make because we assume that it's a no-brainer. You choose the language that you know. You choose the mother tongue. You choose the language of place. That's not necessarily how it usually works. Quite often, there's kind of a fair amount of conscious choice that goes into selecting the language that you use, and of course, selecting the register and how you use that language. As we saw in the most interesting cases that both Murat and Michael showed us, sometimes the choice of language is not this language or that language, but both and. Right, when in the Armeno-Turkish texts, in Michael's poetry, that was both Armenian and Persian Arabic and Turkish. We see that was Michael's poetry that was both secular and sacred. Michael's poetry that was both poetic invention, narrative, and hermeneutics. We see a lot of kind of both and choices being made where multiple languages and multiple registers of languages and multiple literary strategies are being deployed simultaneously in the same text. We see writers trying to have the best of both worlds, trying to be both vernacular and use the cosmopolitan language, to write in a vernacular and a cosmopolitan register at once. And these are the kind of intersections that I find so intriguing in the material that we've just heard. So I want to just kind of give you kind of a provocation, which comes out of some of my own work as well as what we've heard from Murat and Michael today, and then close with some general big questions which Murat and Michael can either respond to, or we can just turn it over to you for your questions. I think that what we're beginning to see, or rather simply to recognize in the world around us, is that monolingualism is, in fact, untenable. It's not a very accurate description of how language works on the ground. Despite the promises of Google Translate, right, that we can communicate seamlessly between languages, and despite the promises of the national language formulation, monolingualism actually does not describe the way that language works in the real world. Once we start translating between languages, mistranslation is inevitable. Mistranslation comes with the territory. And I think that moderns especially came to believe that languages were all, and this is part of the ideology of language, that anything that you can say in one language, you can say in any other language, and there's an accurate way to translate from one language to another, right? This is one of the kind of the beliefs of modern language systems and modern translation theory. But in fact, once you begin communicating between languages, mistranslation is inevitable. And as we heard today, both the poets and also the newspaperman's task is to mobilize mistranslation as aesthetic logic at moments. And also to play with those kind of both and moments, to locate moments when you're actually speaking more than one language at once, and to push those to their logical conclusion. So thinking back to kind of to Murat evoked Sheldon Pollock and his discussion of cosmopolitan languages versus vernacular, a big book, an important book. It's very problematic when it comes to European language theory, all the same, really an interesting book. Pollock refers to the vernacular as the language of place, thinking about this relationship between language and territory in particular. But what is really the place of the vernacular in these texts? You know, where does the vernacular kind of locate itself? Is it really grounded in territory? Is there continuity between the voice and the page? How does text translate itself between voice and page? Or vice versa, from page to voice? If language is both and, can it also be vernacular? I mean, maybe that's the only way to be vernacular in some places, to be both and, to represent multiple languages in a single kind of seamless text, in a single word, as we saw in some of Michael's poems. And what about those misunderstandings and misprisions that occur when you're kind of communicating between languages, when you're translating, when you're writing for a multilingual public? That there's a certain fallacy that language is put out there to be understood. And I think very few, I'm setting up a straw man now, right? Very few people would argue this in any kind of responsible circles and among literary scholars anyway. But we often have a complacent belief that language is put out there to be understood and that we use language, we deploy language in order to communicate. But the goal, I think, sometimes is more often to mobilize ambiguities and to mistranslate in order to unleash new meanings, to failed translation or failed communication as a form of literary production is maybe more common and more productive than we're accustomed to recognize. So with that last provocation, I will close. And I'll let you guys either respond to those kind of, that little manifesto, or we'll turn it over directly to you for your questions. Would you like a chance to respond?
Would you?
Sure. Thank you so much for those fantastic comments. I don't have a totally thought out thought besides I love the formation of both and also thinking about, again, just upsetting the idea that this poetry is meant to be like didactic in a way that just simply is transparent, but is didactic in the way that it forces you yourself to mistranslate and fail to sort of translate the meanings across these different semiotic systems or cultures. I just think it's a really lovely way of putting it. I also think there's a lot of opportunity for rethinking what is translation in this period in a more sort of literal sense. A lot of the works that are translated into early vernacular Turkish, like Gulshehri's variant of Attar's Mantık Ater, are not exactly translations that we think of in the modern sense, and he calls it a talif instead, sort of a compilation or a composition. So there's kind of like a way of rewriting these pre-existing stories by refusing to translate, and that's where the productive work comes into it, I think, for a lot of this material. And Konstantin Yerzhengatsi does the same thing. In one of his more famous poems, his audience asks him to recite a version of the Shahnameh in the same meter. Something I talk about a lot and have thought about a lot, and still don't quite totally understand the whole thing. But he basically does something similar. He translates certain words and a certain ethos, but then he sort of slightly tweaks it to make it about Armenian Christianity in a very loose sense without hitting you over the head with it. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful comments. There are two things I can say, as far as I can understand. The first is your shifting attention from language to register, script, or other choices. That language is a fundamental ethical choice, you said. And actually, yeah, that's what I wanted to do at some point, but I don't have a linguistic background, so I'm trying to find my way in the dark. I feel there is something especially in the register choice. I'm trying to understand, make sense of what it is, but I think that we need more texts for that. The problem is I've done almost all what I have done with the help of friends. Like Hevor Koja gave me that text, Ohannes gave me that, I found that online, this here, I photographed it. So I need something more, and I need many more people just doing the same thing so that I can see what is going on with the register's choice, especially. Because now that we are mesmerized with the fact itself, Armeno-Turkish, yeah, it's interesting, of course, but we need details now, the different registers of language. Because while I was writing my PhD, by the end of the first year, I thought I knew the basic traits about Armeno-Turkish. When I came here, everything changed because I began to see new texts. After I went back, it's a new story. When I dived into the press, the whole thing changed again. So it keeps changing, and I can't control it. The second, this issue of Polacks and the language and territory, like the relationship between language and territory and the conceptualization of language, I tried to find some, to collect evidences about how they talk about language. There are only a few. One is interesting, which is not very common, Hayrenikimin lisanı, my fatherland's language, bless you. And lisan-ı maders, my mother tongue, is used much more frequently, but I don't have much on that. I mean, I can't just formulate an argument. No, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that, you know, even at the time of formation of the European nation states, very few, a very small portion of the population understood what would become the national language. At the time of the creation of France, what percentage of the population? It was something like, it was under 10% of the population who understood French. At the time of the creation of Italy, 2.5% of the population, roughly, understood Italian. The idea that the national language is understood from border to border of the territory of the nation state is one of the most successful kind of ideologies put out there by the European nations, you know? And I think that, you know, that you would find, obviously, you would find the same true, and the Ottoman, which was still an empire. Yeah. So you have to get to a point where you say, if you look at one of these texts and you say, wait, is this Armenian or is it Turkish? And you have to answer that question, yes. You know, I mean, you have to let it be both and you have to think about what those writers are imagining. What are they writing toward themselves? What are they dreaming, you know? And that, I think, that's an ethical exercise. It's really, really interesting. Anyway, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. I'm sorry, yeah. And then Sabu. Oh, you're waiting for the mic.
Thank you for your presentations, and my questions, I think, goes to Murat. Obviously, the target audience of Armeno-Turkish was Armenians. And the question follows, why didn't they then write in Armenian? And one of the answers, as you say, because the main language of those Armenians and their language of those Armenians was Turkish. Then this reasoning tells me that as the rate of schooling and literacy in modern Armenian, Ashkarapar, increased among Armenians, then the popularity and frequency of these Armeno-Turkish texts should have decreased. But it seems that this was not the situation.
Exactly.
For example, one of the texts you showed was from early 1920s. So how do you explain this? I mean, although as far as we know, the rate of schooling and the literacy in Ashkarapar increased among Armenians from mid-1800s to early 1900s. The popularity of Armeno-Turkish texts did not decrease. I mean, they continued to be popular. And second question is related to the Turkish language. It's not my field, but as far as I know, the Ottoman Turkish authors of the time did not use that kind of Turkish used by Armeno-Turkish authors. They used a different kind of Turkish, or let's say more in hybrid Turkish. And in this sense, Armeno-Turkish is also a reservoir of a certain style, of a certain kind of Turkish, I don't know, which may be described as colloquial Turkish. So what is the potentiality of Armeno-Turkish research in terms of Turkish language, to understand Turkish language?
Wonderful questions. Thank you, Hannes. So the target audience, this was one of the things that struck me, because when I was working, I first began with a bibliography. The only thing I had when I had the dissertation as an idea was Hasmik Stepanyan's bibliography of Armeno-Turkish books. That's how I learned the alphabet, in fact, the French translations of the titles and the Armenian. So that's how I figured out the letters. I had no grammar book, whatever. Now, I used the same logic and said, why is not a decrease in the number of Armeno-Turkish books as public education and the teaching of the Armenian language increases? I couldn't find a solution to this, but I could see that there were fluctuations. So, for example, this will be a generalization, but things are not the same in 1850s and 1890s. This guy is saying that the Turkish language, for example, is the only solution to survival in the 1890s. I think 76 changed a lot. Like the Turkish language being compulsory for just being a state official. And mixed schools, again, contributed to like mutual relationships. And then the teaching of Turkish language through Armeno-Turkish became functional. So especially around 1880s and 1890s, there seems to be a boom in Armeno-Turkish publications because a literary market was formed. Like bestsellers from French serial novels like Eugène Sue, Montaigne, like Monte Cristo, they were being published. They sold out immediately. So Muslim Turks probably began to be interested more in Armeno-Turkish because it was easily accessible. And then we begin to see Armeno-Turkish manuals around 1880s and 90s. I thought in the beginning that there was a linear progress, but no, the negotiation thing changes everything. So the schooling, publications, literary market, politics and language. That's why I couldn't figure out what was really going on, but I'm sure that it was not a linear process. As for the second, the Turkish of the time, yes, when I read the novels, when I wrote my PhD, I was sure that Armeno-Turkish was very different from standard Turkish because it was colloquial. Because the authors used like idiomatic Turkish, non-standard Turkish. There was no, even the punctuation or the spelling of a word would change 5 times on a page. I'm not exaggerating, 5 times on a page. But then I realized that Vartanyan himself, as if he did not write Akabi Hikayesi or Boşboğaz bir Adem, wrote the history of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is Ottoman Turkish, high register of Ottoman Turkish in Armenian letters, which is interesting. And then I realized that there were many registers being used. Yes, if we make a generalization, Armeno-Turkish seems to be used more by authors who did not go through formal Ottoman education, so who did not use or could not use the Arabic letters for reading and writing, which is also connected to this being a state functionary thing, because what was intended there was writing and reading Turkish, not speaking Turkish. People think that it's speaking Turkish. No, it's not. It's writing and reading Turkish, which is a totally different issue. So there are registers. For example, Arakelyan's book, Ankara Vukuatı. He worked for the Regi company. He knew Ottoman Turkish really well. So he used that register for writing Armeno-Turkish. But for example, there are examples, when the audience intended can only speak Turkish in daily life and knows the letters, Armenian letters, and the author as well. So I cannot make a generalization for that, but yeah, the register thing is still bothering me. Thank you.
We're at noon, and I see that Sebu had a question, and now Catherine. Okay. Sebu.
Question for Murat. First, I'd like to thank you for sharing many PDFs with me when I was embarking on writing my own article on Armeno-Turkish, and your articles
PDF
were
rules.
quite inspirational.
Yeah.
So I
no
thank
PDF,
you
no scholarly
formally.
work.
Yes. Now moving on to a comment and a question for you. As you know, the very definition of what it meant to be a national subject changed from the pre-modern period, the Anatolian regime, to the modern period of the late 19th century. Namely, it moved from a confessional definition, where religion had a very important role, or confessional boundaries had an important role, to one where race, language, and other factors played an increasingly more important role, usurping the place of religion. Rafi is an excellent example of this. So my question to you is, if one is to give credence to some authors that in the ancien regime world of things, the script is more important than the actual language for defining one's belonging, and therefore Armenian script was more important than the actual usage of Anatolian Turkish. And then that goes with transformation by the 1880s, and language becomes the defining feature, or one of the defining features. Do you see any of the debates on that and on vernacularization of Ashkharapar as manifesting themselves in discussions on whether we should continue, quote unquote, we should continue writing in Armeno-Turkish? Is there any influence, in other words, between the discursive change and belongingness of the nation to the actual practice of writing in Armeno-Turkish? I don't know if my long-winded question made sense to you.
No.
That's one question. The other question was on cosmopolis versus vernacular, right? Sheldon Pollock's concepts. Cosmopolis, of course, in this context, it all depends on what period one is looking at to define what constitutes the cosmopolis for the Armenians. In the 18th century, without a doubt, in the ancien regime, the cosmopolis is Garapar. The vernacular is, of Ashkharapar dialects cannot and never be the cosmopolis. In the 19th century, late 19th century perhaps, the cosmopolis becomes Ashkharapar once Ashkharapar has won the debate. The vernacular is Armeno-Turkish in the 18th century. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, it becomes Ashkharapar. I wonder if you could comment on that as well.
If I could jump here, maybe we could get Catherine's question and then ask for very quick answers. Yeah.
Mine was for Murat, but I can easily ask it of Michael as well. And I was wondering, Murat, to go back to your question to Zovinar about not only about an ethical choice of the use of Armenian Turkish, but maybe a political one, right? That deals with content and the ability to voice different content within the body of the language of Armeno-Turkish itself. And then to ask Michael, obviously, these language choices, right? First of all, they don't exist in the same fashion, right? Literally, the ability for an Armenian poet to actually write in Persian. But then these registers that you cannot actually separate the Armenianness and the Persianness of what Constantine, for instance, is doing with the Shahnameh, and your example as well.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. These are great, but I'm not sure if I can answer them. I'll try. I'll begin with Catherine's question. I think what made me think these was Vartanyan's texts. This Boshboaz Biradem is very interesting in that sense because he was blending the comic and the dramatic in a very unusual way, because it's like satirical sketches, one after the other, and then the framing story is an unhappy love story, again, marriage, an intended unsuccessful marriage is there, but it's kind of an experimental text. And Akabi hikayesi in that context was very radical. Indeed, it was banned the year it was published, and Vatican announced that not even reading it, to keep it at home was very dangerous for children. So I'm not sure if Vartanyan could do it in the Armenian language. So the tradition, literary expectations, conventions, in that sense, maybe Armeno-Turkish could be called a minor literature. Maybe. That's what those are the basic examples I have in mind. And also, maybe 1868, Gülinya yahut kendisi görünmeyerek herkesi gören kız. I had presented about this in the workshop we had done when I was here for Kevork Bardakçıyan. So in that sexuality, and the issue, that was radical for the time, the depiction of sexuality in that text. So that was what I was meaning. Now, confession and race, the transformation of the millet being transformed from like confession to racial modern meaning.
I mean, in terms of national discussions on national identity, the romantic notion of language as the soul of the people becomes prominent only in the late 19th century. I'm wondering if that shift is reflected in people's opinions towards the role of Armeno-Turkish, which would seem okay in the pre-romantic age, where language is not the soul, because of the script. And if that changed at all because of discursive changes and what is the nation?
Yeah, I don't remember at the moment any discussions on the role of script for Armenian identity in Armeno-Turkish texts. It's something like, it's there. It's not to be discussed. No one discusses it. But language is always, from the beginning, why write in Turkish? It's always there as a topic of discussion. Explanation, excuse, justification, apology. It stretches over more than a century. It's beginning with late 18th century, and it's still there in early 20th century. That's interesting. I have not seen a single discussion on the script, the meaning of script for Armenians. And a parenthesis. As for the meaning of millet, the confessional meaning and the modern racial meaning, even in Arakelian's text, which was printed in 1921, they were both used at the same time. Millet as a confessional entity and as a modern entity. So he both used milletdash as Catholic Armenians and the Armenian race, and it changed in the text. It was interesting to see that because it was printed in 1921. And as for the second one, the cosmopolis being Ashkarapar and Krapar, I think the only examples I can just tell at the moment on Ashkarapar being developed belongs to Vartanyan's text again. He is the only, I think, among the texts I read, he is the one who knows Turkish best. He even modified the Armenian alphabet, indeed, to serve certain peculiar Turkish pronunciation. He would put a dot on lün. So for like ince, like a, whatever. So he knew what was going on well. Actually, he made the explanation that modern Armenian has not developed yet, so it's not proper to use it. And Krapar is not understood by most of our nation. That's why I'm writing in Armeno-Turkish. But that's an implication that modern Armenian at some point will serve the nation for communication, and Armeno-Turkish will be a step towards it. Those who read Armeno-Turkish, as time passes, will be interested in Armenian, modern Armenian, and there will be more modern Armenian texts, and yeah, things will be okay. That's what I can say.
Okay, no. I have to. Let's give Michael a chance to answer the question about the ethics of language choice, and then we have to.
Okay, I'll keep it really, really short. First, I'll just say we do know that there are some times when authors do choose to bring in whole Persian sentences into the Armenian script, even in this early period, like when Frick brings in this Persian verse and writes it in the Armenian script, supposedly in the 13th, early 14th century, or slightly later with Grigoris Akhtamartsi, who writes sort of this macaronic poetry that alternates between Persian and Armenian lines. I think that we can definitely say there's a very heavily meditated upon or highly selective usage of these other languages. They've really thought about why they want to bring them in and what kind of effect they want to achieve in the reader. And I think To a lesser extent, the same is true in general just of their usage of loanwords. Sometimes they bring in a word to create a set of associations, perhaps, in other languages beyond Armenian. Sometimes they do it because perhaps that was the word that Armenians used in the more spoken vernacular register. Sometimes they do it for purposes of rhyme. They like the Persian rhymes rather than the Armenian ones. So I would just say, wrapping all these thoughts up, it is definitely a yes and, but it's also a yes and but.
Nice. It's a good place to stop.